Asterisk, on April 10, 1912, the British city of Southampton stood on the edge of its dreams, proudly bidding farewell to its great liner, the Titanic, which was then described as the unsinkable ship. It was huge, luxurious, and unparalleled, designed to be a technological marvel ahead of its time. Inside, it teemed with life, wealthy people boasting about their first-class tickets, and immigrants dreaming of a new beginning in the new world. Asterisk. But what no one knew at the time was that this voyage would transform from a symbol of pride and achievement into a tragedy that shook the conscience of humanity and became one of the most notorious maritime disasters of the 20th century. Everyone knew that the ship struck an iceberg and sank, but few knew that a tiny piece of metal, a simple key, could have saved 1,522 lives. Asterisk, the man who didn't sail, and the key that wasn't handed over. Asterisk, the day before the Titanic set sail, British sailor David Blair was preparing to join the crew responsible for security and watch. An experienced seaman, he had served as second officer, and one of his primary duties was to oversee the precise instruments used by the watchers on board. Most importantly, the binoculars, which allowed them to see what was coming from miles out into the ocean. Asterisk, however, suddenly, in a sudden administrative decision by the ship's owner, White Star Line, was decided to remove David from the voyage and replace him with a more senior officer named Charles Lightler. This last-minute decision caused confusion in the handover of duties and responsibilities among the crew. Asterisk, amid the chaos, David Blair left the ship without handing over the key to the binocular locker located in the upper control tower, where the binoculars were supposed to be ready for the watcher's use throughout the voyage. Asterisk, closed binoculars and bare eyes against ice. Asterisk, the first hours of the Titanic's voyage passed smoothly, and the weather was calm. None of the passengers suspected any danger. Even the crew members felt confident in this giant ship. Asterisk, but on April 14, 1912, after 4 days of sailing, the weather suddenly began to cool, and the ship received several warnings from other ships reporting the presence of icebergs in the area. Asterisk, on that fateful night, Frederick Fleet, one of the watchmen in the watchtower, was on his night shift. He didn't have binoculars, neither did his other colleague. All they had were their bare eyes, roaming the darkness of the North Atlantic, amidst thick fog and bitter cold. Asterisk, at 11:40 p.m., Fleet shouted at the top of his lungs, "Iceberg, right ahead." But the shout came too late. There wasn't enough time to completely change the ship's course. The Titanic was hit on its starboard side, and its hull was torn apart underwater. Water began to flood into the engine rooms, and the disaster began. Asterisk, a confession after surviving ... Asterisk, after surviving the disaster, Frederick Fleet testified before the Commission of Inquiry, saying something humanity will never forget. Asterisk, if we had had binoculars, we could have seen the iceberg from further away, and we could have had enough time to divert the ship, and the disaster would not have happened. Asterisk, his words were a slap in the face of time. Binoculars locked in a small safe with a key in the pocket of a man who wasn't even on board were responsible for the loss of 1,522 lives. Asterisk, the key that reappeared 70 years later. Asterisk, David Blair never forgot the key, stayed with him for the rest of his life, like an unhealed scar. He had no idea that his failure to hand over a small piece of metal would be the cause of one of the worst maritime disasters in history. Asterisk, David kept the key, and after his death, it was inherited by his daughter, Nancy. She, in turn, gave it to the British and International Seafarers Association in the 1980s, believing its natural place was in the hands of those who recognized its historical and symbolic value. Asterisk. In 2007, several original Titanic memorabilia items, including the key, were auctioned. The key sold for £70,000, not because it was a rare piece of metal, but because it symbolizes how a simple mistake can change the course of history. Asterisk, was it fate or negligence? Asterisk, what happened on the Titanic raises questions to this day. Was it inevitable fate? Or was it the result of administrative negligence and a failure to hand over a simple trust in a timely manner? Could it really be that so much blood was shed and hundreds of lives lost because of a key forgotten in the pocket of a man who had left the ship? Asterisk, the reality is that the Titanic sank not just because of an iceberg, but because of a series of errors, improvised decisions, and technological arrogance that led the voyage organizers to believe nothing could sink the unsinkable ship. Final cat. Imagine going back in time and seeing that David remembered to hand over the key to Charles Lightler before leaving the ship. Imagine that the binoculars were in Frederick Fleet's hands on that cold night. Imagine that scream came just 1 minute before the impact. Asterisk, today we might be talking about the Titanic as a successful voyage, not as a floating grave at the bottom of the ocean. But history is not written in imagination, but in tears.